today's session is about how to prevent mobile caching with the iForm app. As I mentioned, I'm Barrett, and Jonathan Sue will be going through this content. And with that, John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Barrett. All right, so everyone, I'm really happy to be presenting this topic for us today. Mobile caching is something that a large part of our user base has had some experience with, and I'm pretty confident that there's a group as well who probably have had experience with it, but you may not be aware of it having been part of what you're going through. So we wanted to go ahead and have a webinar, kind of bring everything to the surface, share the experiences that we've had, and share best practices as a result of those experiences, and just open up the conversation for anybody to ask questions and learn more. So for today's webinar, we're going to go through a brief agenda here. We're going to start by introducing this idea of mobile caching. Barrett mentioned that there are a couple of people here who are just checking things out. Most of you are active iForm users, but we still want to make sure that we're defining what I mean by mobile caching, so that you have an idea of if this is happening to you or if you've experienced it in the past. After we define that, we're going to go through explaining why mobile caching happens, and then eventually that will lead into strategies to prevent it. And we do have a look into the future for everybody as well, just so that you're aware, kind of leading into the second half of the webinar. I'm going to be going through techniques that you and your form builders and your admins can go through kind of today to address mobile caching, but we're also going to be introducing some of the new features and functionalities we're going to be building out kind of in the remainder of the year to make mobile caching and form building as a whole easier for our entire community. So we're really excited to present that to everybody. So to get things started, we have to ask the very basic question: what is mobile caching? And the simplest definition that I have been able to come up with is it's when a value is present from another record. And so for those of you who are familiar with using the iForm app, when you open up a form, it's going to show you that view of the single form. You can scroll through, answer questions, fill out values, and then you can either complete that record and then start a new record. Sometimes you may save a record and go to another record. I know we have a lot of groups who collect data over a longer period of time, and you're not necessarily filling out a record A to Z, submitting it all in one go. So anytime you're doing that, jumping between views, if you notice that there is a value that's present from a previous record or from another record, that's how we define mobile caching. And so essentially, it's a value that really shouldn't be there. I can give a quick example of what this looks like. So if I fill out this form here, the first time I fill it out, I'll enter in my first name, and then I'll enter in my last name. And then at the bottom, there's a simple formula to concatenate for the full name. Now, after I submit that and I open up a new record, you notice that my name is still there. And that's an example of mobile caching. So even though the form is essentially supposed to be blank, we have a value from the previous record still stored there. So why does mobile caching happen? And in order to answer this question, there are a few fundamental concepts about the structure of the app that you need to be familiar with. The first is this idea of a dependency tree. And the dependency tree is just a really fancy way of saying the app knows when to update values. So for example, in the previous form that I showed, the app needs to know when to update that full name field. It knows that because there is a dependency between that third element and both of the elements above it, first name and last name. So that relationship between the elements, it creates a tree structure. And so when one element is updated, the app knows to cascade through that dependency tree and update or reevaluate any of the other elements that are related to the first element that was modified. So that's the first major concept we need to understand. The second concept we need to understand is that there are two primary ways of referencing values or building out your smart controls. And so the way that we like to describe these is we have easy references, and then we have form path references. Easy references are most likely what the majority of you are used to seeing and used to using. And when you have an easy reference, all you're doing is using the name of the element to reference that value. So if, just as a reminder, the name of the element is not necessarily the label that you see on the app, but it's the unique identifier, all lowercase, no spaces, what we call database friendly. And so you just use the element name in your smart controls. And quite honestly, that works like 90% of the time, 95% of the time, especially for simple forms. I would say it's almost 100% success. It's the easiest way to get started. It's what people resonate with when they begin on their journey as a form builder. Now, the form path is a little bit more complex because instead of using only the element name, what you're going to be doing is prefixing the form's name at the beginning, and then you're combining that with a period, what's called the dot or the accessor operator. So it would be something like form dot my element one, as opposed to just the element name my element one. If you've done any smart controls with subforms, you actually have used the form path and you may or may not be aware of it. But the form path ends up being a longer reference because it starts with that parent form name. Now, with those two primary ways of accessing your elements, it's important to understand the differences in their behaviors. And this is really driving down towards the root of the mobile caching behavior. So easy references are going to hold their value until they're overwritten. So what that means is, for example, when I enter in first name, if I'm using just the easy reference for first name, that value does not get changed until I enter in a new value, presumably in another record. Conversely, the form path reference is going to be cleaned up every time kind of a new screen is displayed, every time a new record is loaded, is the better, more accurate way to say that. So when I fill out my first record and then I complete it and I open up a new record, or even another existing record, each time I'm opening up that different record, the form path references are being fully refreshed, cleaned up and refreshed, so you don't experience that caching. However, going back to the easy references, they wait until they're overwritten, and so that's why you'll see previous values in them before I've entered in a new value in that field. So taking these two concepts, the different references and the dependency tree, caching ends up being caused by the combination of using easy references. But then there's another aspect to this, which I haven't mentioned yet, but I'll introduce here, which is using dynamic values to counteract that behavior. And so I am pretty sure this is something that's familiar with a lot of the attendees here. You'll set the dynamic value of the first name field to something like first name equals and what we call an empty string, just a pair of double quotes next to each other. And what you're doing is you're taking the dynamic value and you're using it to overwrite those easy references to circumvent the caching. So you're going through a two-step process to overwrite the caching instead of doing the one-step process, which is using the form path reference. So if you have caching, it becomes this cat and mouse game of building out your smart controls with the easy references, testing your form, seeing if there's caching opportunities or incidents, and then circling back to the dynamic values to try and compensate for them. And what we've seen with a lot of our customers is that kind of tug of war works for quite a while until it doesn't, especially when it comes to making form changes, when it comes to starting to build out complex references, because you're dealing with both the smart control of the actual calculation and the dynamic values to clear the caching, it becomes difficult to manage the two. So having explained why mobile caching happens, I wanted to bring us through an example. And what we're going to do is go through that animated form that I showed you earlier, but we're actually going to break it down and I'm going to show you all of the different components behind the scenes for how that form was built. So what I have here is 2 screenshots of the form. On the left side is going to be the first time I fill it out. On the right is going to be the second time I open that form, prior to filling it out, but after having completed the first record. And that third element, full form name with the easy references, the dynamic value is listed here. And so it's simply first name concatenated with a white space and then concatenated with last name. So that's how I build out first name space last name. Right. Now, I mentioned that the caching is a two-part dynamic, right? We have the aspect of caching, which you see here, but then inevitably what ends up happening is form builders will then use clearing values in the fields that are being referenced in first name and last name specifically. So then we end up with something that looks like this. I have dynamic values in first name equal to an empty string. The same thing in last name, it's equal to an empty string. And then I have the same original dynamic value, first name plus a space plus last name. And that gets us to the point that we want to be visually, right? We fill out the form, the formula works, we go to a new record, and everything looks fine. Everything's cleared out. Now, there's a couple of challenges with this. The first challenge is you simply have to know. You have to know to clear out these values. Additionally, because we have such a diverse library of different elements and data types, each element comes with its own clearing mechanism. In fact, we even have an article on how to clear the different element types. So that's the first part of it, is just the knowledge of knowing that it has to happen and how to get it to work. But then there's a second aspect to this, which is, let's say we want first name to have an actual dynamic value other than the clearing. What do you do? Because there's only one place to enter in that smart control. So then you start getting these exceedingly complex dynamic values, condition values, where you have to check for a variety of different scenarios or behaviors or circumstances. And that's when the form design starts to become untenable. It becomes overly bloated, larger. And then when you have to come back to that form to troubleshoot or to build something new or to even copy that form, it becomes very difficult to decipher what's going on there. Now, this example of first name, last name illustrates what mobile caching is and how to see it, but it doesn't really talk about the implications and the impact of this that this can have on your actual real world data. So I have another example here, and this is a little bit more of a fleshed out example. I'm using what's called a select element, where we have those the buttons that you can press on inline in the form. And then we have a number element that is going to be conditionally shown or hidden based on the answer above. And then we have this read-only element called benefit code. And this field is meant to take the information from above and code it in a way that presumably another system would use. In this example here, benefit code is going to be one of three values, either a 0, a 1, or a 2. And then the organization can take that value and make decisions off of it. The problem here is, even though I have benefit code shown in the example, this is the type of an element that more than likely is probably hidden in your form. You set the condition value to false. The data collector doesn't need to see it. They don't particularly care about that field because they're not filling it in. But then the data collector, who normally is your first line of defense in seeing irregularities in the data, is unaware that it's happening. And so because they can't see it, they're not able to alert the organization about it. And you end up in a scenario where this data can be coming through and you're unaware of it. And then the worst thing that we want to have, or the thing we don't want to have happen, the worst thing that could happen, is that the data leads to errors in decision making. One of the things we pride ourselves at Zerion and in iForm Builder is really being able to build out forms that allow you to collect really rich, robust, accurate data. And so if you end up in a situation with caching, it's kind of counter to that ethos. To dig into this form a little bit more, I want to deconstruct the dynamic value that comes along with the benefit code. So if you're not as familiar with some of the smart controls or JavaScript, this may be a little bit foreign to you, which is why I want to go through and deconstruct it. Functionally, the way this form is going to work is it begins by showing this question of, do you have children, yes or no? And in the event you choose yes, the question underneath it, how many children, will be displayed. And then in this case, I entered 3 as an example. Now, benefit code has what's called an if statement in the dynamic value. And so based on following through the statement, it's going to assign one of those values to 1 or 0 to benefit code. It begins by checking number of children, which is the number element, the second element in the first screenshot. If number of children is greater than 2, then it will assign the value 2 in benefit code. However, if that's false, it will move on to the next statement, the next condition. So if number of children is then less than or equal to 1, presumably 0 or 1, then the value that goes to benefit code will be the number 1. And then if none of those things are true, if number of children is not greater than 2, if number of children is not less than or equal to 1, then it's going to be equal to 0. And that 0 is important because the scenario in which that should happen is if they choose no to that first question, just kind of bringing the form full circle. So what you can see here on the right screenshot, the second screenshot, when I open that form a second time, right, when I fill out the form and I say no, the problem is that the value in number of children has been cached. That number element is caching. More specifically, or more accurately, benefit code is referencing the cached value because we're using an easy reference. And so like I mentioned earlier, if that field is hidden, the data collector would have no idea. And then the only real way to identify this is through kind of an audit of the data that comes in and noticing the irregularities in your export. And so even though I choose no to this, I assign the wrong benefit code. And then as I mentioned, we don't want this because now I have bad data, and that's going to lead to errors in decision making. I threw a lot of information at everybody kind of in a really short, compressed time frame. So I want to pause here, and I also want to kind of throw back to Barrett to see if there are any questions, and then to launch the first kind of content poll that we have planned for everybody today.
So far, we have had some questions come in. And the first one is just, what are some form building tips for identifying the caching early on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So kind of that cliche, like prevention is the best way to kind of forward. What you want to do is really be thorough in your form building up front. And in terms of tips to identify caching, the tip that I found really that works for me the best is to do condition values last. And so, and actually, let me go back up to that slide. I mentioned it, multiple times. The biggest reason that this can go kind of unbeknownst to the form builder and to the data collectors is because that field is hidden. And so because the field is not shown, you really have to manually go back and look through the actual data itself to identify it. So when you're building out forms, I always do the dynamic values and the client validation, all those fields first. And once I know that my entry is sound and I'm getting the right data that I'm expecting, then as a final step, I go through the condition value property to build out the business logic to control the visibility of the elements when I need to. But I only do that once I'm confident that the data coming in is accurate and precise to what I expect. The other tip I have, and this really shouldn't come as a surprise, as I mentioned, there's two different ways to do the references at the beginning of the webinar. The best thing you can do to prevent caching is to use the form path reference. We'll get into what that looks like in the second half of the second third of the webinar. But that form path, although a bit longer as a reference, is going to give you the highest level of integrity when it comes to referencing your data, retrieving values in your forms. So those two tips are what I would recommend, using the full form path to start, but then also as a general practice, condition value at the end of building out your forms once you know that and you're confident that your data is in the shape that you expect it to be.
Great. And I have one more question for right now. This is about an individual who's using public links, using iOS devices, and using Android devices. Mm-hmm. They're wondering, do they have to test on all three, or with the new form structure, the longer path, if it works on one OS, will it work on all of them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and actually this is going to go right back to that recommendation I had. The first thing I would say is to test on all three, just to give you that peace of mind that everything is working as intended. But what I will say is that we have learned from experience, and web forms, public links, in my experience, has been better about not having those caching issues. It just seems to operate better in terms of cleaning up. I actually anticipate a lot of that has to do with the app design, because the web forms and public links are kind of one-offs. You don't have this carryover from form to form, record to record as much. But I would recommend testing on all three devices. Again, though, that full form path is going to behave consistently, congruently across all three operating systems, more so than easy references, which is just yet another reason why I advocate for those over the simple references.
All right, John, and I know I said I had one more question before, but now I have one more question. They keep
Okay,
coming in,
it's
and
okay.
everyone
Bring
keeps,
them on. They're
yeah,
good.
bring them on, exactly. So this one you and I have talked about before too. This individual says, if there's a way to get the form path for subform elements, it'd be great to have a tool that can help form developers know the path to the subform elements, which can become complex when getting into like a child form, grandchild form, great grandchild form, and so on. So again, I know we've talked about it. I know you're going to talk about it on this other half here, but what do you think about having some way to help or suggestion for when you do have those longer paths?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and I am gonna jump ahead. I'll give a little bit of a preview. Gotta find it. I think it's right here. Um, so this question has come up before. Referencing subform elements can be, and I would even say is tricky, especially when you get into not just like a child, what we call a child form, but grandchild, great grandchild, etc. Having some inbuilt tool would be nice. I think it would help minimize error, but I don't think it necessarily makes the form building experience better per se. What we've done so far is I've shared this with countless different customers in the past. This is a really brief kind of slide deck on how to reference subform values that like I said, I share, I go through, and I do have this step-by-step guide for these complex references. It is literally a do 1, do 2, do 3, rinse and repeat. No matter how long your reference is, it's not to be kind of mean about it, but it's kind of brainless in the way you have to go about it. But I do that so that you don't have to kind of apply judgment to the process, and it gives you accurate results every single time. So it's a manual way to go about building out your references instead of having like an inbuilt mechanism to generate it for you. What I'll say is for those complex references, we're actually planning on going a different direction in terms of how we address this to the user base. Instead of giving you tools to build complicated stuff, what we're looking to do is to make the reference simply not as complicated. And so, like Barrett had alluded to, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I wanted to address the question as much as I could.
Okay, so with that, I think that's all the questions for now, but keep them coming as we go forward. I do want to launch our poll. So have you experienced data caching in a production environment? And so if everyone could just take a minute and respond, that would be great. All right, so almost 50% have responded. And it looks like the vast majority of individuals have experienced it. Once we get a few more responses, I will share the results on the screen so that everyone can see what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results. So this is what we're looking at here, John. A lot of people have experienced it for sure.
That's kind of what I expected. I think that's even representative of the fact that we have a help desk article on clearing the values, right? Like that just goes to show this is something that customers have come up against in the past, and frequently enough that we felt the need to have to put out documentation around it.
For sure. Well, I'm gonna hand it back to you, and I'll keep the questions coming when they come in, and we'll answer them at the next poll as well.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we defined what mobile caching is. We kind of illustrated how it happens, and we talked about the real world implications of the data caching as well. So now we'll get to kind of the important part of the webinar, which is how do we prevent caching from happening? Obviously, we don't want the data to cache. It leads to bad data or discrepancies in your data, and then that can lead to bad decision making. So we want to build our forms in a way that caching does not happen. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a second look at those two form examples that I showed earlier, but we're going to apply the full form path to them, and we'll compare and contrast to see what they look like. So here I have the same form, but I've added a fourth element, full name, and then this is using that form path reference. So functionally speaking, they're intended to do the exact same thing. And as you see in the first screenshot, I enter in first name, last name, I get my full name on both of those fields, and then I hop over to the next record, and you'll notice that with first name and last name empty, I have that caching, right, in full name for the easy references. And then for the full name with the form path reference, which you'll notice here, and I didn't really write on the screen, but the form name here is called example1. So this is what I named the form. You get this undefined, which I know it kind of is unsightly, but I left that there specifically because I wanted to illustrate kind of in explicit terms that those values are clear. They are no longer there when you go into the next view, even to the point where they are an undefined value kind of in memory. So if we look at these two forms, this is what you get when you use the full form path versus the easy reference. But then, right, obviously when you have caching, especially if you're going through the exercise of revamping an old form or an existing form, you more likely than not have these clearing dynamic values. So how does this impact them? Say, well, everything looks great, honestly, right? We have first name equal to empty quote, last name equal to empty quote. First name and last name still function as we expect for both the easy reference, and then now even the full form path is cleared. And we may kind of add in the full path and then say, we're good, like things are good, we can just stop here. I left this in specifically because I want to caution people about leaving those clearing dynamic values in place. If you're building your form correctly, the truth is that you shouldn't need them at all. Like if I go through forms that I've built in the past or forms I built currently and moving forward, it's almost like a design rule of mine to not have any dynamic values, any smart controls that enact this clearing capability because it shouldn't be needed. What that really means is that I'm referencing something somewhere that I'm not supposed to be. All right, and so even though this may appear okay, you're actually just in the same scenario as you were kind of at the very beginning of your form builder journey where you did your easy reference, everything looked okay. But then down the line, you run into these operational scenarios where, hey, somebody filled out a second record, but they didn't fill out that field, data caching, or you're bouncing between two records and you end up with data caching. And it was something that you just missed during testing. So if we add in the full form path here, we test and we say we're good, you can run into a similar scenario. And I'll even kind of go through a history lesson. Back in, I think it was like 2018, we took a crack at kind of unlocking this caching challenge. And one of the changes that we tried to apply was cleaning up the easy references the same way that we clean up the full form references. And it ended up causing so many irregularities in customers' forms that we had to revert the change and we had to not go down that path. One of the benefits of iForm Builder is the flexibility that we give for you to build these complex references, but then at the same time, we have our customers using the forms in very creative and novel ways. And so it's quite honestly impossible for us to anticipate all the different ways people have built forms. One of the other things that we've seen happen and we've tried to do is to make modifications to that dependency tree in the way we evaluate. And in those scenarios, these clearing values would actually clear out the data that was entered. And so you would run into a scenario where I would type in my first name, Jonathan, I type in my last name, Sue. Then what happens is that triggers a dependency to modify the full name fields, but then it was related to last name and first name, which then reevaluated and ended up clearing out because we have this dynamic value. Hey, this is supposed to be an empty string. So this is just a long-winded way of me saying that you shouldn't stop here, even though things look okay. We want to go a step further with the modifications we make to the form. And in order to remove those dynamic values for first name and last name, but we also don't want that undefined that we saw on the first slide. We don't want this here. The real way to do this is to take the responsibility of your smart controls and try to be as precise as possible with them. The more precision you apply to these smart controls, the more reliably they'll perform. And so what I'm going to do here is I've cleared out the dynamic values for first and last name. So we're not doing that empty value anymore. And I've taken the full name at the bottom and I've wrapped it similarly to what you saw with the benefit code in an if statement. And so here, the dynamic value states, if, and then this is that full reference, the form reference, if example1.firstName, this is a shorthand way of just saying it has a value. It's not a falsy value. So if first name has a value and last name has a value, then do what's inside these curly braces, which is my original dynamic value. And so in this scenario, we get the original behavior, we fill it out, we get our full name. But when we open up that next record, because there's no value in first name and there's no value in last name, we don't execute what's inside of this if statement. So this element is still empty. Whereas you see, we're back to the caching problem up here with the easy reference. And so this is just kind of a bit of a cautionary tale, a bit of advice I can give all of the form builders out there. When you're building out your references, it's really good to be precise with the way you build it and the way you write everything. Kind of the guiding principle I use when I build forms out is I don't build the forms to work. I build the forms so they can't break. It's almost like it's a different way of looking at the same coin. Building it so it works means great under optimal scenarios, circumstances, I'm good. Building it so it can't break means if I have someone who fills it out the way I don't expect, I have someone who's interacting with the app in a way I don't expect or they're not supposed to, the form design is robust, it's durable enough that it can sustain those abnormalities and still give you good data in the shape that you're expecting. So using these two principles, right, the full form path and then also being precise with our references, let's take a look at that second form with the benefit code and how this ends up being modified. Now, we were already being precise with this dynamic value using that if-else statement, but what we're going to do now is be even more precise in terms of the references. Instead of using the easy references, we're going to use those form references and include, and this form was called example2. So example2 dot number of children greater than 2, else if example2 dot number of children greater than or equal to 1, and the rest of the structure is the same. Now, one thing I also want to talk through here with this example is with number of children being a number element, this is something that we've seen in the past and it's become a kind of a point where some of our form builders have gotten stuck. A text element clearing out to be an empty string, while not ideal, at least is an empty value. So what that means is, generally speaking, as a user, you don't particularly mind if your data is either null or an empty string. It's functionally the same thing. There's no value there. However, with a number element, because the value must be numeric, we don't have the option of putting in an empty value there. I can't say, oh, number of children equal to quote, quote, because that's not a proper value. Whatever value gets expressed in a number element must be numeric. And in fact, if you put in a non-numeric value, the form is going to interpret that, or the app is going to interpret that error as a 0. And so what that means is you may end up with adverse calculations in your form, right? If you put in a clearing value here, if you try to do empty string, this would have an error and be set as a 0, which would then cause this to evaluate to a 1 instead of that 0. Another scenario is if you don't put in an erroring value, you still have to put in a number like 0, for example. Let's just say you set this to 0. That's going to mess up your calculation. I've seen other customers in the past put in a number that is, for lack of a better word, kind of bogus, something like a -1 or like a 1 million. They'll put in a number that contextually doesn't make sense. And then in their if statements, they'll flag for that number. They'll look for that value. And it takes the place as a proxy for being empty. But again, as I mentioned during the first portion of the webinar, all we're really doing at that point is adding layers of complexity to our form design. And that just makes it even more and more difficult to troubleshoot, modify in the future. And so we don't want to do that. So for these reasons, I again go back to advocating for that full form path using the form name dot element And again, I also just wanted to reiterate for the number element, particularly the number element, it's very difficult to clear out the element. It's kind of impossible. And so when you end up with those zeros in there, there is a difference between a 0 and a null, as opposed to an empty string and a null. And so I wanted to caution everybody out there about this potential inconsistency. Going back to the first poll, we had an option in there which said, no, but I have to check, meaning this sounds like it might pertain to me. I'm going to go take a look. And so I wanted to also bring this use case to the surface so that when you're doing your investigation, you're aware of this and are vigilant to look out for it. So after having gone through those two forms, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of these best practices that have kind of come up over the years through the experience of our customers they've shared with us, the experience of the customer success team as we build out forms and we live in the form builder and the app on a day-to-day basis. So here's a list of best practices or maybe tips and tricks for everybody on the webinar today. The first best practice, and this is not necessarily for caching, but this is just a good form building practice or best practice, is to avoid using generic element names. Don't have your form be my element 1, my element 2, my element 3, or the more compact Q1, Q2, Q3. We see this all the time. And that doesn't necessarily address caching, but what it is going to end up impacting is your ability to troubleshoot a form, your ability to take a look at a form at a glance and understand what's going on, what you're trying to do, what the intention of the smart controls is. That name is really critical in providing context to the smart control and to the form at large. And so you want to avoid using those generic names. The second best practice here, this does pertain to caching, is if you can, try to avoid using the same element name within a single form structure. What I mean by that is if you have a parent form and a subform, try not to use the same element names across the two, because that I've seen has also led to caching in the past. And that one's tricky because a lot of the times it's a very common use practice where form builders will take a value from the parent and pass it down to the child. And so it's literally the same value. It makes sense to use the same name, but we've seen this cause caching issues in the past. And so just if you can, try to avoid doing that. The third best practice is just a reiteration of what I've mentioned so far during this webinar, and you should make it a design goal to remove any clearing dynamic values. If you start from there, no clearing dynamic values, what's ultimately going to happen is your form is going to kind of break, right? Especially if you have a long-standing form that has a lot of these mechanisms in it. Start by clearing out the dynamic values. So then you're kind of at a baseline with your form. And you know, hey, all these smart controls aren't working the way I want them to work, but that's going to allow you to then go in and replace those easy references with the full form path, and then your form will slowly work towards a state of stability as you go through that process. What you don't want to do is the opposite, which is replace all the values, and then as you remove the clearing dynamic values, your form breaks a second time, and then you have to go through that process again. It's more efficient to start by just removing the clearing values and using that as your baseline. Coupled with this fourth best practice, use the easy references instead of the full form path. I've talked about that enough, so I'm not going to go and rehash everything. This fifth best practice is to use guides and references, learn from the community whenever possible. I have a link here to the slide deck on how to reference subform values for all the attendees on the call. So use the available resources. I'll also throw a shout out to our Customer Success Center here as well. We have a lot of good documentation on there. The community forums as well. People have posted challenges they've run into and solutions they've come up with. It's just a great way of not having to reinvent the wheel when you run into any challenges. And then these last two tips are centered around building, developing, and testing. But when you go through your testing sequence, make sure that you include these two scenarios, which is to complete sequential records, meaning you fill out one record and you don't just stop there, but you open up a second record and you fill it out again, because that's when you're really going to see the potential for caching. And then the second scenario would be to alternate between filling out two records simultaneously. So I start record 1, I fill out some fields, I save, I go and open a second record, number 2. Fill it out a little bit, save, go back to record 1 and make sure that you're not running into caching in that scenario as well. From a real world point of view, those are the two scenarios where we see caching happen more often, or happens the most. And so you want to incorporate that into your testing. So with that, we've talked through the different strategies that we have for mitigating or preventing the mobile caching. Barrett, check in with you again. Are there any questions that the audience has raised that I can answer? And then also to do our second poll.
So there were some questions. When you just went through the best practices, I think that it was, at least one of them was answered, which was about the dynamic values, where we got so accustomed to just defaulting to 0 or doing the empty string, where you're saying take all of that out and start fresh when going through it. So I think that one was answered. The other one that came up that you touched upon briefly, but may need a little bit more attention, just because it can be a little bit more complex, is let's say you are using a subform that has multiple parent forms. So each form that you build has the same subform attached. How do you do that when all this full form path is referencing the parent form?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for those in the audience who may not kind of understand exactly what Barrett's describing, it's a scenario where you have a subform with two different parents that are attaching to that subform. And so in that scenario, when you have smart controls on the subform level, you need to pick which parent you're referencing. And the short answer is there isn't really a good, clear way forward. If you're in a scenario where it's only 2, then you can use the built-in function like parent form name to dynamically route. Oh, if it's this form, use this reference. If it's this form, use that reference. Obviously, as the number of parents to that subform increase, that smart control becomes exceedingly complex. The other recommendation I have, honestly, is just to make a duplicate of the subform. What I found in the past is I've tried to do what I thought was the efficient thing, keep the single subform and try to be complex in the references. And it worked kind of at that time. But as requirements change, as new projects come in and use that subform, I eventually ended up at a point where I just took that subform, made copies of it for each of the parents. And so I have a one-to-one relationship, one parent to one child form across the board. So those are the two examples or the two suggestions I would give. Either copy the form so you have that one-to-one relationship, or in the smart controls, you can check for which parent it is and then build your references appropriately.
All right, great, thank you. I've also found that just doing the copy of the subform is much easier. Now, I do see another question coming in. Oh, it's just someone else who actually does the same thing that you mentioned, where they just rename the subform. So it effectively is using the same form, but they rename it and are able to use it for their parent form. So at this time, let me go ahead and launch our poll, our last poll of the day, and just trying to find out everyone's comfort level right now after what John's gone through. So do you feel comfortable fixing your old forms to use the full path? If you could select one of the answers, yes, you feel comfortable. No, you don't feel comfortable, but, or the last option, yes, but I don't plan to. And for those of you who are selecting no, I would be curious at what would make you feel a little bit more comfortable. So if you want to add that in the question or chat area, just to let me know, that would be great. Or if you're selecting no, we will do a follow-up email. And if you want to give more details, then that's always helpful too. Looks like almost half of everyone has responded, so I'll give it another second here. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and show you those results, John. So we have about 67% who says they feel okay with it. At 33%, we definitely want to help you out to make you feel a little bit more comfortable.
Cool. I'm glad the third option has a 0. It makes me happy.
Yeah.
I was worried. Yeah, it's good. I think that just means we did a good enough job illustrating the urgency and the importance of making sure that the data is in good shape. All right. Barrett, before I keep moving forward, just wanted to check one last time if any other questions came through during that poll.
The only other thing that came up was that there is a concern with going back and changing that smart control on live forms. Is there a possibility that would wipe out any data, or is it really just taking the time and making sure people aren't collecting data as you go through making those changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of data loss, unless you're changing the data type, you don't need to worry about that. The data will still be there. But I think the bigger challenge is really making the modifications in a live environment, because you have presumably people using that form, right? And then you can't just make all the changes in one go, hit save, and then all of a sudden everyone has a new form. It takes iterations to go through, it takes testing. So the best advice I can give you there is to not do it in a live environment. There's two ways to do that. The first way, which probably won't work that great, is to make a copy of the form, because at that point the form name is different. So your references are going to be ultimately not the same, because your form name has to be that specific value. But what that can do is give you a risk-free environment to see how modifications will impact the form. So it's more of an investigative process. And then once you know, then you can make the changes to the live form. The other thing I would recommend over just making that copy is considering a sandbox environment. I know that we offer sandbox environments for our customers as an add-on to your subscription. What that would allow you to do is take a backup of your environment and then make the changes there so you're not impacting your production team. Once you know what changes need to be made, then kind of same scenario, you can go back in and make the changes in the production side with confidence.
Thank you, John. I think that's good for now. And for everyone who's curious about sandbox environments, I'm going to put a link in the chat so you can learn a little bit more.
Thanks. Awesome. All right. So last part of this webinar is we're going to take a sneak peek, a look into the future. I mentioned this at the beginning. We're kind of going the route, not necessarily giving you more tools to build out those complex references, but what we want to do is make the form building experience just kind of easier for everybody. And the way we're going to be doing this is with what we're kind of calling semantic references. And so these semantic references are going to be relative in scope. The goal is for them to be easy to use. And then also we're going to be adding this as an existing option for form builders. So at this point in time, we're not taking anything away, we're just adding tools to the toolkit. I will say that given the challenges that can come up with the easy references, and under the assumption that these semantic references end up being on the easy side to implement and to use, we would like to move into a state where you can kind of build with really high confidence regardless of the references you're using, and potentially look to doing things with the easy references and moving away from them. But for now, we're just going to be adding to what you have available. And what this is going to end up meaning for everybody is your smart controls will be portable. So if you make a form package or you duplicate a form, these references will still work in that duplicated form. Additionally, it's going to improve the speed of troubleshooting. I know that our team runs into this on a daily basis where we're asked for help troubleshooting a form, and we go in there and we see the element, the user says, hey, this field's not filling out the way I expect it to. We open up the form, we find that element, we see a smart control there, but then the problem is we have no idea where those elements that are using easy references exist. It could exist in the same form, it could exist on the parent, it could exist in a separate form. We really don't know, and so we have to go searching for it. Having these semantic references that are relative in scope are going to allow you to look at the reference and immediately go, oh, I know where this field is. And then the last thing here is this reliable execution. It's going to take all the best parts of that full form path and then merge it with the ease of use of the easy references. So what this is going to look like is 3 keyword objects. And so right now you can just use the the regular easy reference as the element name, or you can use the form name. And what these references are going to be is instead of the form name preceding the element, you'll use one of these keyword objects, self, parent, and top. I'll explain what each one of them does, but hopefully these terms are self-explanatory enough that you can start to already see how this would work. So in any given view that I'm in on the form, so the record that I'm in, it only has one single self, it can only have one parent, and it can only have one topmost record. Obviously, a parent can have multiple children, but when you work your way up the tree, it's always going to be a one-to-one relationship. And you actually see that evidenced in the iForm data or iForm Builder metadata, where you have like parent record, parent page, parent element ID. So because we can know with certainty what you're referencing with one of these three keyword objects, we're able to reliably populate them and make the references available. And as I mentioned, these keywords are relative in scope, but they also provide context. So when it comes to troubleshooting, like I mentioned, you will know where this field exists. If it says self dot first name, I know with certainty, I mean the element first name in the form I'm in, nowhere else. If it says parent dot site location, I know I have to go one level up to look for that reference. Now, there are scenarios where these objects can overlap. If you're in a flat form, meaning there's no subforms, right? You're just single layer form. Self, parent, and top are effectively all the same thing. So there are going to be times where it overlaps, but as you build out your forms and as your complexity increases, these three keywords start to differentiate themselves from one another. So what I want to do now is take a look at a before and after, right? What can this look like? So down at the bottom here, I have three examples of smart control references. We have some descriptions on the left. So we'll start with a simple reference on the parent level, right? If we use the full path, that would be, in this case, our form's name is inspection. We say inspection.status. This can work great for that single form, but as soon as we duplicate the form with a new name, this doesn't work anymore. And so what we can do is we can change this to say self.status. Now, if I duplicate this form, make a copy of it, it will work in that copy. Going back to the idea of adding two number elements in a subform, right? We don't want to set those clearing values for numbers. We're in a subform, so the reference is complicated. This is what it looks like right now with the full form path. So I'm essentially saying in my form inspection, in this subform name safety, for the current index I'm in, because you can have multiple subform records, I want the value of puddles, and I'm going to add it to within that same record, because I have the same parent form subform index, add it to the value for loose cables. And so we can simplify this by just saying self.puddles plus self.loose cables, taking out the entire need to drill down through that subform structure. We're just saying, hey, relatively, right, to the view I'm in, grab the element that's probably literally right next to me, and let's add these two values together. So this is going to be much more portable. It's much shorter. It's easier to use. And even this would even work if it was like a grandchild reference, to just elaborate on the functionality. And then this third one here, we're creating an ID from the site name, which is on the parent level, and the job code, which is going to be on the grandchild record. So if you think about a form where you're going to a place to do an inspection, you list the site name, you go into the different, perhaps the different locations within that site, and then the different safety violations that you may have. And so you have to list the different corrective jobs that need to happen in order to firm that up. Right now, this would look like this: form name.site name, because this is on the parent. And then we would add it to, this is the form, subform, current index, grandchild subform. This is all a big piece for current index, and then job code eventually. And this whole piece should be able to be modified to top.site name. This is the topmost record, parent. And then self.job code. And then this would look something like, I'm just making up some value here. Let's just say the site name is Zerion, and then the job code would be something like 4567, right? We could get a value like this, where we're concatenating the two together. But the main takeaway here is that the semantic reference is going to be vastly easier to implement, more reliable, and able to discern the context from it. And the last thing I'll say here before we kind of throw for another set of questions and we wrap up is our current roadmap, our plan here is to implement self. Q3 is a time frame we're giving ourselves to be able to build this out and implement for mobile apps. And then we're actually going to do a round of feedback before we go through with parent and top. In discussions within the team, within our customer base as well, the feedback that we've received is that self is really going to be kind of the initial game changer. And so we want to start there, get feedback, knowing that we're already addressing the primary need, so that we can make sure that if there are any modifications or adjustments we need to make for parent and top, we'll be able to do those without having to go back through and kind of gut everything and start over. So that's the plan. We're really excited about this. And Barrett, one last time, any questions?
Sure, I have a question and then a comment.
Perfect.
The first question I answered, but I think it'd be beneficial for everyone else to hear, and you might have a little bit of a different answer than me. So the question is, when full form path, or when the self parent top record come into play, will the full form path still be available? So any JavaScript that was used to reference subforms, referencing other subforms, those will continue to work, correct?
That is correct. Yeah. Full form path will continue to work. The easy references will continue to work as well. We're simply adding a tool to your toolkit. The main reason we're doing it this way, though, is the reality, the understanding that building out forms is not a kind of a one-shot process, not even an overnight process, right? It takes time to build out these complex forms that so many of our customers have taken advantage of and built out. It's what makes our platform stand out from everything else. So knowing it's going to take time for our form builders to adopt this new reference style and retrofit all their old forms, we're going to give you full access to all three of those methods when we release this.
Great. And then our next comment is this individual is really excited because they believe it will help when passing to Zerion documents.
I don't know how much this will help with Zerion documents. Not to put a wet blanket on the enthusiasm, but this is really going to help with the form design. And then once the data is collected, these references don't apply anymore, right? The references only apply when we're talking about the capture of the data. Once the data has been uploaded, or really once the data has been captured and it's in just its data format, these smart controls don't apply anymore. And so when we talk about Zerion documents with the mappings on your custom templates, I don't know if this will come into play. It shouldn't. The only reason I say I don't know is because I'd want to think through it a little bit to make sure I'm absolutely certain. But my initial response to that is it won't pertain. They're two separate things.
Okay, great. That's the last question that we have, at least right now. If anything else comes up in the meantime, everyone just please continue to send us questions while the webinar goes on, but also after the session, we're happy to answer questions too.
Absolutely. All right, so with all of that being said, thank you everybody. We have a couple of announcements before we close things up. Barrett, do you want to go ahead and go through the announcements? Do you want me to do it? Either way is good by me.
Doesn't matter. I'm happy to do it. So for the first announcement we have is that we have our final iForm Builder Form Builder certification of 2023. It's going to be our final online version. It's June 27th to June 30th. It's 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. I've included the link in the announcement here, and I urge you to sign up. We already have a good amount of individuals already registered, but of course we want more. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer it. We'll be sending the link along with our follow-up email. And that follow-up email will come in the next 24 hours once our audio and video and materials are ready for everybody. The next announcement here is to save the date. So we are going to have on-site iForm Builder certification and Zerion workshops on September 19th through the 22nd, and that will be in Herndon, Virginia. So we'd love for you all to attend. If you want to attend the workshops and not the certification or vice versa, that's okay. We'll be sending out more information about that in the near future, so definitely keep your eye out for that. Our next webinar, July 19th, is converting Smart Table Search to the lookup element. So if you're somebody who's still using our Smart Table Search and you're interested in using the lookup instead, definitely attend that webinar. With that, John, I want to thank you. I think this was really helpful. I think the way that you presented the material was just awesome. So thank you for getting that ready. And for everybody who attended, I really appreciate your participation and your time out of today. And we look forward to hearing from you in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great one.